Every Space Marine is proud of the armour they wear into battle, and in this video we're going to show you exactly how to paint 8 chapters of the first founding from Battle Ready Standard up to Parade Ready Standard. Now, each model has already been painted up using the Indomitus Alternative Chapters Battle Ready video, so if you want to prepare your models, go and check that out first. If you've already done that and you're ready to move on, grab your paintbrushes and let's get started. Now, the first chapter we're going to look at are the Noble Blood Angels. And we've already got our model here up to Battle Ready Standard, so it's time to start highlighting it. We'll start off with that famous red armour, and for this we'll start with a highlight of Wild Rider Red, moving on to a highlight of Fire Dragon Bright after it. And for both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot here and onto our palette. Now, we want this highlight to be nice and subtle, so we're going to add some water here to thin our paint down. There we go, just like that. We're also going to make sure we've got a nice smooth point on the brush to make sure these details are going to be nice and fine. Then onto our miniature. Here we're going to be painting it very carefully onto the edges of each of the power armor panels. So just very carefully moving it down the edge of the power armor panels like so. Now you'll note that I'm being really careful here and taking my time because it's important to be neat, but don't worry if you do make a mistake, you can always go back with a Mephiston red paint in a pot and correct it. It's important to take your time as doing this, and it will take quite a bit of time to do the entire Space Marine like this, but the effect will be worth it once it's done. Next up, we're going to apply a very fine highlight of Fire Dragon Bright over the top. Now we thin this down quite a bit to make sure it's super fine. I'm going to use the edge of the brush along the vertices of the power armor here to get a really fine highlight that's painted inside the one we've just applied. Again, do this all over your Space Marine and take your time to be as neat as you possibly can. And there we go with that. That's the red armor of our Blood Angel complete. Up next, let's have a look at the black Aquila on his chest, and for this we'll highlight it first with Eshin Grey, followed by a highlight of Dawnstone, and again for both we're using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot, and again onto the palette like this with the Eshin Grey. Touch of water, there we go, bingo. Then onto the miniature, apply the Eshin Grey onto the Aquila like so, just very carefully picking out the tips of the wings, leaving the lower bits the darker colour. Next up, apply a very fine highlight of Dawnstone to the very tips of the wings of the Aquila. Once this is done, we're going to go back and paint the rest of the miniature using the technique seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. There we go, that's our Blood Angel done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting those mysterious Dark Angels. Now again, we've already got the model up to Battle Ready Standard here, and so first of all we're going to start highlighting on the armour with Warpstone Glow, followed by a highlight of Moot Green. For both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot here and onto our palette like so. Now I'm going to mix a little bit of water in here just to make sure the highlights go on super smooth, and also we're going to make sure we've got a nice point on our brush by rifling it back like so. Perfect. Then onto our Dark Angel miniature. Here we're going to be very carefully painting highlights around the edges of the armour panels like so, just very carefully picking out the edges of the armour like this. Now Warpstone Glow is quite a thin paint, so it will go on quite subtly, but that's absolutely perfect. Take your time as you're going around the miniature like this, make sure you're very carefully picking out just the edges of the armour panels. And don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back later and correct it with Caliban green paint out of a pot. Next up, we've thinned down some Moot Green, and here we're going to very carefully place it just outside the highlights we've already placed. But be very careful here, we just want really sharp highlights on the edges of your armor panels like so. There we go, that's our armour highlighted. Up next, let's paint the Chest Eagle or the Aquila on our Dark Angel, and for this we'll start with a highlight of Shabti Bone, and over the top of that a highlight of White Scar. Again, for both of these we're using our small layer brush. Let's grab some paint from the pot and onto our palette here like so. Maybe just a touch of water as well, just to thin it down to make sure it's going on nice and smoothly. There we go. Then onto our Dark Angel. Here we're very carefully going to be painting the tips of the wings and the skull on our Aquila. So just picking out the raised areas here, but leaving the lower down areas the original colour. Just very carefully just picking out the tips like so. Then we'll take some White Scar and pick out just the very tips of the Aquila here, again with a small layer brush. Just very carefully picking out the tips like this. There we go, that's the Aquila done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting those red weapons casings on our Dark Angels. And for this we'll start with a highlight of Wild Rider Red, and after that a highlight of Fire Dragon Bright. For both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush again. Let's grab some Wild Rider Red from the pot and onto our palette like so. Again, we're going to add a little bit of water here, just to make sure it's going on nice and smoothly. We're also going to make sure we've got a nice point on the brush as well. There we go. Then, onto our Dark Angel. Here we're going to be picking out the vertices and edges of our weapons cases, just bringing that Wild Rider Red paint back, dragging it towards you along those edges like so. Do that all over the weapons cases and on both the gun and the chainsword, and move on to the next stage. And then next up, we're adding a fine highlight with Fire Dragon Bright here just around the very edges of the miniature like so. Once this bit's been done, we'll go back and finish the rest of the model using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. There we go, that's our Dark Angel Parade Ready. Up next, let's have a look at the Stoic Marines of the Imperial Fists. And we're going to start by highlighting up that yellow armour. We'll start with a highlight of Flash Gets Yellow on the edges of the armour panels, and over the top of that we'll use Dawn Yellow, and both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. So first of all, Flash Gets Yellow. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot and onto our palette. Now here we want to make sure it's a nice smooth and thin highlight, so we're going to add a bit of water here just to thin it down, and make sure our brush is nice and thin on the palette as well. Bingo. Then onto our Space Marine. Here we're going to be very carefully dragging the Flash Gets Yellow around the edges of all of our armour panels, like so. Just very carefully drawing thin lines of highlight around the very edges, like this. Now you take your time over this, make sure you're being as neat as you possibly can. It's really worth spending the time to get as neat an effect on this armour as you possibly can. Next up, we're going to take the aptly named Dawn Yellow, slightly thin with a touch of water, and using a small layer brush, just very carefully pick out the very edges of the armour as well. So we're just going over the highlight we've already done, this time using the edge of the brush to pick out the absolute sharpest edges all over the power armour. And there we go, that's the yellow armour highlighted. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the red on this miniature. That's going to be on the shoulder pad trim, the Aquila on his chest, and the wax on the Purity Seal too. We'll start off with a highlight of Mephiston Red, and then on the Aquila only, we'll highlight it up with Fire Dragon Bright as well. First of all, it's time for that Mephiston Red, and here we're using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot again, and onto our palette here, a bit more paint. We also want to make sure it's thinned down a little bit with water to make sure it goes on real smooth. Then, onto our miniature. Here, we're going to be applying it in two different ways. First of all, we're going to be highlighting up the Aquila by just tapping very lightly onto the ridges of the Aquila here, leaving the lower bits the darker colours. Then, on the shoulder pads, we're going to be highlighting the very edges as we did with the armour, so just dragging the edge of your brush around the shoulder pad trim like so, just to get a nice highlight there. And once that's done, we're going to go back with some Fire Dragon Bright, which we've slightly thinned down, and just touch up the very tips of the feathers on the chest eagle like so. Once that's done, we're going to go back and complete the model using the tips and methods found in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. And there we go, with that, our Imperial Fist is ready to defend Terra. Up next, let's have a look at the Iron Hands. And here we're going to start off by highlighting up the black armour. We'll start with a highlight of Eshin Grey, and over the top of that, a highlight of Dawnstone, both of which we're going to use our small layer brush for. So first of all, the Eshin Grey. Let's take some paint out of the pot like so, and onto our palette. Now we're going to want this first highlight to be nice and subtle, so we're going to add a bit of water to thin it down a touch to make sure it's going on real smooth. We're also going to make sure we've got a nice pointy brush by just rifling it back on our palette like so. There we go. Bingo. Then, onto our miniature. Here, we're going to be placing these highlights very carefully around the edge of the armour panels on our Iron Hand miniature. Very carefully drawing thin lines around the edges of each of the armour panels like so. Now, this is where you want to take your time, make sure you're not rushing it, and just make sure you're being as neat as you possibly can. Go around the entire model like this on all of the armour panels, and once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. Next up, we've thinned down some Dawnstone, and again using a small layer brush, we're just going to very carefully pick out the very edges of each of the armour panels. So what we're doing here is we're painting inside the highlights we previously applied. So you can see we're actually leaving a little bit of the Eshin Grey already showing there. Just be really careful with this and take your time to get the model right. Don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back and correct it with the Eshin Grey if you want to. And there we go, that's our black armour highlighted. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the white weapon casings. Now we'll start off with a highlight of Korax White, followed by another highlight of White Scar. And for both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of Korax White from the pot onto our palette here. As this is a base paint, we're going to be adding a little bit of water to make sure it's going on nice and thin. Perfect. Then, onto our miniature. Here we're very carefully going to be picking out the edges and the highlights on the white weapon casings. So just very carefully just drawing it around the edges of the casings like so. We're going to do this on both the bolt pistol here and the chainsaw as well. Take your time, just make sure it's going on nice and smoothly and be as neat as you possibly can. Once that's done, grab some white scar again on your small layer brush and just pick out the absolute edges and very finest points of the gun like so. Once we've done this, we're going to go back and complete the model using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. There we go, that's our Iron Hand Parade Ready. Alright, up next let's have a look at the Raven Guard, and here we're going to paint our black armour slightly differently. We'll start off with a highlight of Dark Reaper. Over the top of that, a highlight of Thunderhawk Blue. And for both of these, we'll be using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of Dark Reaper from the pot like so and onto our palette here. Now just a touch of water here to make sure our highlights are nice and thin and going on nice and smoothly, maybe a bit more water. There we go. Perfect. Then also make sure we've got a nice point on our brush before we move on to the miniature. Now here, we're very carefully going to be placing our highlights onto the edges of the armour panels like so, and just working our way around the entire miniature, very carefully, just touching the very edges of each panel like this. Now don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back later on and touch up that mistake with a pot of Corvus Black if you'd like to. Take your time on this, it's really worth being as neat as you possibly can. Next up, take some Thunderhawk Blue, and we're going to add really thin highlights inside the ones we've already applied, using the edge of the brush around the miniature like so. Again, take your time on this, it's important to be as neat as you possibly can. And there we go, that's the black armour highlighted. Up next, let's have a look at highlighting that red trim on the shoulder pad, and here we're just going to use one paint, Troll Slayer Orange, and a very careful highlight using a small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and again here, as we're making a nice thin highlight, we're going to thin it down just to make sure it goes on really smoothly. A bit more water, there we go. Then onto our miniature. Here we're very carefully just highlighting up the edges of the shoulder pad trim like so. Take your time on this one and be as neat as you possibly can. Once this is done, of course, we're going to go back and finish the model using the techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. And there we go, that's our Raven Guard ready to sneak into battle. Okay, up next let's have a look at the fiery salamanders, and here we've only got 3 paints to use. We'll start off by highlighting the green armour with Moot Green. Once that's done, we'll highlight the black with Eshin Grey and then Dawnstone over the top of it. And for all of these, we'll be using our small layer brush. Let's start with Moot Green, and let's take a little bit of paint from the pot like so and onto our palette here. Now, we're going to be thinning it down with a touch of water to make sure it's going on nice and smooth, a bit more water. And also make sure we've got a nice pointy brush by very carefully rifling it back on the palette like so. There we go. Then onto our Space Marine. Here we're very carefully going to be painting this Moot Green as a highlight around the armour plates like so. Carefully taking our time to just put a really thin line around the very edges of the armour all over the entire model. Now this will take some time, but it's really worth taking your time to make sure you get it as neat as you possibly can. But don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back with the Warpstone Glow and correct it later. Next up, adding a highlight of Eshin Grey onto the black areas of the miniature. Again, we're just working around the edges of the power armour, so this is on the backpack here and on the shoulder pads too. Very carefully working around the edges like so, making sure we're being nice and neat. Again, don't worry if you make a mistake, just like I have there. Be able to go back with the black paint and sort that out. Next up, we thin down some Dawnstone, and we're just putting it onto the very sharpest edges over here on the backpack. Again, be as neat as you possibly can, and use the edge of the brush like this to make sure you're only hitting the very edges of the backpack. Once this is done, we're going to go back and finish the miniature using the techniques and methods seen in the Indomitus Parade Ready Ultramarine video. And there we go, with that, our Salabander is parade ready. Alright, up next let's turn to the ferocious Space Wolves of Fenris, and here we're going to start off by highlighting the armour. We'll do a highlight of Fenrisian Grey all over the armour panels, and for this we're using our small layer brush. Let's take some paint from the pot like so and onto our palette here. Now again, for a highlight we're going to thin it down just a touch with water to make sure it's going on really smoothly, and we're also going to make sure we've got a nice point on the brush as we're doing nice small highlights. There we go. Then onto our Space Wolf. Here we go, and what we're doing is we're adding small highlights all over the miniature on the armour panels. So very carefully we're drawing very tiny lines of highlight along the edges of each of the armour panels like so. Being careful to take your time and make sure it's as neat as possible. Don't worry if you do make a mistake here, you can always go back with Rust Grey and correct it if you need to, but do try to take the time and be as neat as possible. There we go, that's the armour highlighted. Alright, up next let's have a look at those coloured shoulder pads on our Space Wolves, and first of all the left-hand shoulder pad, the yellow one. What we're going to do first is give a nice layer of Uriel yellow all over the shoulder pad to give a nice solid colour. Then over the top of that we'll give a highlight of phalanx yellow. First of all, that layer of Uriel yellow, and for this we're using our small layer brush. Let's take some paint from the pot and onto our palette. Now we want this to be quite a subtle layer, so we're going to add quite a bit of water here to thin it down just a touch to make sure it's going on quite thinly. A bit more, there we go. Maybe a bit more. Yeah, bingo. Then onto our miniature. Here we're just very carefully applying this over the top of the yellow that's already been applied. You'll notice it goes on quite subtly, but don't worry, that's absolutely fine. We want a nice subtle coat over the top of what we've already painted. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to bring it up to the edge of the miniature like so, and leave the original contrast paint showing near the edge like so to give a nice sort of shaded look to the miniature. Next up, we've thinned down some phalanx yellow, and we're going to apply a nice thin highlight around the bridge of the shoulder pad like so, just at the top, like this. There we go, that's the yellow shoulder pad done. And next up we'll look at the red shoulder pad. Here we'll add a layer of Mephiston red over the top of that highlighted Troll Slayer orange. First of all that layer, and again here we're using our small layer brush. Let's take some paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Add just a little bit of water into this as it's a base paint, and we want a nice thin, almost translucent layer of paint going over the red. Then onto our miniature. Here we're carefully applying it over the top of the red shoulder pad here, just picking it out like so. You'll again notice this is going to be quite subtle, and just put it up to about the edges there. What we're doing here is getting a nice solid colour over the top of which we're going to add a highlight later on. Next up, take some Troll Slayer orange, again thin it down slightly, and just drag it round the bridge of the shoulder pad at the top here, like so, to have a nice little highlight in. There we go, that's our shoulder pads done. Alright, up next let's have a look at an optional extra here. We're going to show you how to paint the pack markings onto the shoulder pads of your Space Wolves. Now different Space Wolf units have different pack markings depending on their battlefield's role, and as our assault intercessors here are close support, we're going to add yellow pack markings on top of the red. We're going to use Avalanche Sunset to do it, and we're going to use our small layer brush, and here's how. Let's take some paint from the pot like so and onto our palette. Now here we're going to thin it down quite a bit to make sure it's nice and thin so that it goes on the model really smoothly. Perfect. Then onto our miniature. Okay, so first of all we're going to add a single dot of Avalanche Sunset in the centre of our shoulder pad at the bottom like so. Then 2 dots either side, almost to the edge of the shoulder pad but not quite. One there and one there. Then we're going to add 2 dots central in between those two but at the top of the shoulder pad. So one here and then one here. Then we're going to draw lines carefully between these dots like so. So here we go, just going to draw very carefully up like this, connecting the dots like this. There we go. And once that's done, we're going to do then, we're going to fill in the area at the bottom with Avalanche Sunset. Make sure we're going to get a nice solid coat as well. And don't worry too much if you go over the lines or it's not as straight as you like. You can go back with your Mephiston red and tidy that up. And once this is done, we're going to go back and finish the rest of the model using the techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. And there we go, with that, our Space Wolf is parade ready. And last but not least, it's time for the white scars. And we're going to start off by highlighting that famous white armour. We'll start with a highlight of Corax White, and over the top of that another highlight of White Scar, both of which we're going to use our small layer brush to apply. Let's take some Corax White from the pot here and add it to our palette. Now Corax White's quite a thick paint, being a base paint, so we're going to add quite a bit of water here to smooth it down to make sure it's nice and thin when applied as a highlight. There we go. Then onto our miniature. Now here what we're looking to do is to highlight the edges of each of the armour panels like so going around the model. Now you'll notice this is going to go on quite subtly, but that's absolutely fine for a first highlight on a Space Marine like this. We're going to take our time and make sure our highlights are nice and neat all over the miniature like this. There we go. It really is worth taking your time over the miniature to make sure you're as neat as you possibly can be. Next up, we're doing the same again, but this time with the White Scar. We're applying a little bit less paint just onto the very edges of the arm panels like so. In fact, you can use the edge of your brush like this as you go around the miniature. Just make sure you're picking out just the very, very edges of the armour panels. And there we go, that's the white armour done. Alright, up next, let's have a look at highlighting up the red Aquila on his chest. And for this, we'll start with a highlight of Mephiston red, followed by a highlight of Troll Slayer orange. And again, for both of these, we're using our small layer brush. Let's take some Mephiston red from the pot like so, and onto our palette. Cheeky bit of water just to thin it down a little bit. There we go. Then onto our miniature. Here on the Aquila, we're just very carefully highlighting just the edges and tips of the chest eagle. So just picking out the raised areas here like so, leaving the deeper areas the colour we already have. Also just work the red towards the outside of the Aquila like this to give a really cool winged effect. Next up, some Troll Slayer orange, which we've slightly thinned down with a bit of water. And here we're going to add just some highlights onto the Aquila here, just on the raised parts and the very, very tips of the wings as well. And once we've done this, we're going to go back and finish the model using the techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Parade Ready video. And there we go, that's our white scar done. And that concludes our video showing you how to paint the alternative chapters of the first founding up to Parade Ready Standard. Remember, when applying those highlights onto Space Marines armour, you need to thin down paint, a small brush, and really take your time to make sure you're as neat as possible. If you'd like to finish off any of the models seen in this video, go and check out the Indomitus Parade Ready Ultramarines video as well. And if you'd like to add a texture base to your model, go and check out the Indomitus basing video too. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting!